anymore. Not just simple exhaustion or feeling confused, but the deep sense that your old self can no longer continue to exist. Everything that once defined you, your roles, your beliefs, your relationships, suddenly feels unstable or begins to fall apart. Carl Jung believed moments like these do not come by accident. They are the deepest trials of the soul, where the ego is forced to loosen its tight grip on control. When the mask can no longer hide the truth, and you can't keep living on old answers, the mind enters a dark space that not everyone is brave enough to stay inside. Many people decide to return to what feels familiar. They repair the old image, try to stabilize the outside, and call that healing. But if you didn't do that, if you allowed the collapse to complete its full cycle, then it is very possible you have passed the most painful test a human soul must face. Not to destroy you, but to end a way of living that no longer fits who you are becoming. Stay until the end of this message, not to find comforting promises, but to name what you survived. Because when you understand what you have truly gone through, you will slowly begin to understand why you are no longer the person you once were. Why were you pulled into the darkest phase of your life? There is a difficult truth to accept. Not everyone is drawn into the darkest phase of their life, and if you have been there, it reveals something clear about who you are. According to Carl Jung, the deepest psychological crises do not appear randomly. They arise when someone has lived too long inside a structure that no longer reflects their inner truth, yet continues to maintain it through effort, habit, and adaptation. At first, there were no dramatic warnings, just a quiet tiredness that is hard to describe. The things that once inspired you now feel empty. Achievements that once made you proud no longer bring any real sense of aliveness. You still perform your role well, still meet your duties, still appear fine to others. But inside, you begin to feel unfamiliar to yourself. Jung saw this as the stage when the unconscious begins sending signals. But because the ego is used to organizing, explaining, and controlling everything, those signals are often ignored or explained away with simple labels like stress, just fatigue. It will pass. An old classmate of mine, Anna, someone who went through this stage very quietly, once told me her life did not collapse on the outside. But one morning, standing in front of the mirror, she no longer recognized her own eyes. Not because her face had changed, but because the person looking back no longer felt like her. She still smiled, still worked, still fulfilled expectations, but everything felt like an empty routine. Anna tried to fix it in the usual ways until her body reacted: insomnia, anxiety, burnout. She said, "I didn't break down because life was too hard. I broke down because I lived too long as someone who was no longer true to me." From a Jungian view, her story is not unusual. It shows what happens when the ego tries to protect a lifestyle that no longer supports the soul's development. The ego is skilled at adapting, pleasing others, meeting expectations, and building an image that fits the environment. But the self, the deeper center of the personality, does not care whether you look successful or not. It only cares about what is real inside. When the ego and the self remain out of alignment for too long, tension becomes unavoidable. What makes this period so painful is not only loss, but the ego's helplessness. The strategies that once worked stop working. Logic cannot give satisfying answers. Familiar advice starts sounding empty. Jung emphasized that this is exactly when the unconscious begins to take the lead, not to destroy you, but to return you to a deeper order. Yet from the ego's point of view, it feels like being dragged into a dark and chaotic place without direction, where everything that once gave orientation no longer functions. Jung once wrote, One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The darkness does not appear as punishment. It appears when something inside can no longer be postponed. It rises when what has been suppressed has gathered for too long, when the distance between who you truly are and who you have been pretending to be becomes greater than the psyche can handle. Only those who have lived in that inner conflict long enough are placed in a situation where they must face it without escape through distraction or denial. You can imagine the human psyche like a house built very early in life. The first bricks are placed so you can be loved, accepted, and safe. Over time, you add more floors, more roles, more duties, more images of who you should become. Everything still stands. It may even look stable from the outside, until the foundation can no longer support the weight of all the layers you have added. The dark phase is when the foundation speaks, not with words, but through collapse. That is why not everyone enters this stage. Many people shrink themselves to continue living inside the familiar structure. They adjust their dreams, blur their inner voice, and accept emptiness as normal. But those who are pulled into the dark phase are often the ones who can no longer deceive themselves. Even if they do not fully understand it, their soul has refused to keep living a life that does not reflect their deeper truth. Going through this does not mean weakness. It means you reached a point where truth became more important than comfort. The dark phase is not a random accident. It is the psyche's necessary response when the old structure has finished its purpose. This understanding does not remove the pain, but it places it in its correct meaning, as a clear sign that the old version of you is no longer enough for the life ahead. When your entire inner world collapses, the most frightening part is not just the suffering, but the complete disorientation. You do not only hurt because you lost what you once believed in, you hurt because you no longer know what to rely on to keep moving forward. The principles that once supported you fall silent. The values that once guided you stop responding. It is no longer the feeling of going in the wrong direction. It is the feeling that there is no direction at all. According to Jung, this is when the ego no longer has the ability to organize lived experience. The ego is designed to function inside known systems, clear identities, specific goals, and measurable rewards. When those systems dissolve, the ego reacts with anxiety, control, or despair. But Jung argued that what is happening is not chaos. It is a deep restructuring process that the ego cannot control. An image from the Bible that captures this state strongly is the story of Paul the Apostle, once known as Saul on the road to Damascus. Before that moment, he had a clear identity, strong beliefs, and a defined mission. He believed he was right and serving a higher purpose. But in a single instant, the light did not guide him. It blinded him. He lost direction, lost sight, and lost his former identity for a period of time without knowing what would come next. From a Jungian perspective, this was not instant enlightenment. It was the collapse of an old inner world. He could not return to who he was. But he had not yet become who he would be. The old belief system no longer worked, yet the new one had not formed. That suspended state is what inner collapse feels like. You cannot go back, but you also cannot yet move forward. Jung believed such phases cannot be understood by ordinary logic because what is dissolving is not a single opinion, but an entire psychological structure. The unconscious no longer whispers. It floods consciousness with strong emotion, intense dreams, inner images, and the feeling of losing control. From the ego's perspective, it feels dangerously directionless. But Jung saw it as a necessary stage in individuation, the process of becoming whole. He also wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. When the inner world collapses, the fear is not only about losing order, it is about no longer being able to avoid the full truth of who you are. The parts once hidden to maintain stability begin to surface. Contradictions cannot be solved quickly. And while the ego wants clarity, this phase forces you to stay in uncertainty longer than you would choose. Inner collapse is not loud destruction. It is more like sudden silence after music stops. The instruments are still there, but no melody plays, and in that silence you are forced to pause, not to create noise again, but to allow a new rhythm to slowly form. When the mask falls and you can no longer pretend, the exhaustion is not only emotional, it is physical. You no longer have the strength to maintain the image you once carried. Not because you suddenly became courageous, but because pretending became too heavy. In Jungian psychology, this is the moment when the persona, the social mask, can no longer remain central. The persona helped you survive. It allowed you to be accepted and safe. But Jung warned that when a person fully identifies with their mask, they lose contact with their deeper self. When the inner world collapses, the mask weakens. You begin to feel clearly the distance between what you show and what you are. The most difficult part is not that you changed, it is that the world still expects the old version of you. That difference creates loneliness, not because no one is there, but because few can meet you where you now stand. The death of the ego follows. What remains when even the idea of me no longer feels solid? The ego begins to dissolve, not as punishment, but as necessity. Imagine the ego as a shell around a seed. For a long time, that shell protects growth, but if it never cracks, nothing new can emerge. The breaking feels like loss, but without it, life cannot continue. What was buried begins to rise, feelings you once ignored, desires you once suppressed, truths you once avoided. They appear not to destroy you, but to be integrated. Jung saw this as making the unconscious conscious, not becoming perfect, but becoming whole. This process does not happen once, it happens in layers. Each time you release an outdated belief about yourself, another layer dissolves. You do not become flawless. You become less divided inside. Then comes loneliness, letting go, and the point of no return. Loneliness here is not about being physically alone. It is about standing on different inner ground than before. You cannot fully return to old compromises because you have seen their cost. The point of no return is not knowing exactly where you are going. It is knowing clearly where you cannot stay. And finally, who did you become after the soul's trial? Not someone louder or more impressive, but someone who no longer abandons themselves to survive. The ego still exists, but it is no longer the absolute ruler. A deeper center guides you quietly. You move slower, but with more alignment. You react less, but feel more clearly. You no longer need to prove you are fine. You simply live more honestly. As Jung said, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes." After this trial, you begin to live from inside outward. Strength changes its meaning. It is no longer about control. It is about alignment. It is knowing when to stop, when to speak, and when to walk away without guilt. In the end, the most important thing is not what you lost in this journey. It is what can no longer be taken from you. After all the breaking, you carry a quiet awareness. You can sense when you are living in truth and when you are not. You no longer need constant approval. Your inner voice is clear enough to guide you. The soul's deepest trial does not turn you into someone else. It removes the layers that covered you for too long. Individuation, as Jung described it, is not becoming special. It is becoming whole, and wholeness is often quiet. It shows in how you choose to live slower, more honestly, and without betraying yourself just to belong. If these words touch something in you, pause for a moment before moving on. No need to analyze further. Just sit with the feeling of being present. The road does not end here. It opens into another way of living, quieter perhaps, but deeply true from within.